5-6 Graphs of other trig functions, day 1. In this lesson, we're now going to look at the cosecant graph, which uses the sine curve. So if you look at my unit circle, sine, remember, is the y values. At 0, sine is 0, and if you do the reciprocal, it's undefined. So let's go over this again before we start. The x values are theta, the angles. The y values are cosecant of theta. So at 0, so is where we're starting, if you do the reciprocal, it's undefined, which means it's going to have a vertical asymptote. At pi over 2, the reciprocal of 1 is 1. At pi, the reciprocal of 0 is undefined, so we have another vertical asymptote. At 3 pi over 2, the reciprocal of -1 is -1. And at 2 pi, the reciprocal of 0 is undefined. So what happens is when you graph the sine curve, it would look like this. I'm just going to dash it because we really aren't supposed to see it. So when you do the cosecant curve, cosecant has a relative minimum. So relative means it's not really the minimum. And a relative maximum. So that's how the cosecant curve looks. Now, as far as everything else that we did for sine, you're going to do the same thing. I'm just going to put everything back. If you see plus c, remember you move left. C units. And if you see minus, you're going to move right c units. Your midline is always y equals d. And remember to get your key points. You're going to start at your phase shift and do 1/4 times your period. So in example 1, we're going to look at this graph of cosecant. But remember, we're going to use the sine graph. So I'm going to just rewrite this. Remember, we got to factor out a 2. So when you do pi over 2 divided by 2, that's pi over 2 times the reciprocal, which is 1/2, which is why it's pi over 4. So for the sine graph, your amplitude would be the absolute value of A, which is 1. Your period is 2 pi over B, and B is 2. So your period is just going to be pi. Your phase shift, we're moving left, pi over 4. So that's going to be your first x value would be at negative pi over 4. Your midline, we have a midline now at y equals 2. And remember to get your key points, you do 1/4 times your period, which is pi over 4. So we're adding pi over 4 each time to get our 5 values. Alright, so I'm going to take negative pi over 4 and add pi over 4, which is 0. 0 plus pi over 4 is pi over 4. Pi over 4 plus pi over 4 is 2 pi over 4. 2 pi over 4 plus pi over 4 is 3 pi over 4. Okay, so let's see how this looks on our graph. when they say the midline is 2, this is now your new 0. And since my amp is 1, we're only going up 1 and down 1 from your midline. Okay, my first X starts at negative pi over 4, then 0, then positive pi over 4, 2 pi over 4, and then 3 pi over 4. So remember, when you're doing the reciprocal, our first X value has an asymptote. Then we're at and then my next one has an asymptote. Then I go down. And then my last X value has an asymptote. So remember, sine would go like this, or curve in this direction. But cosecant, remember, is the reciprocal. So it's going to have a relative minimum and a relative maximum. Now in this example, let's see what happens when A is negative with the cosecant graph. So remember, we're going to use the sine curve. I'm just going to do it like this. All right, my amplitude is the absolute value of A, which is 1/2. My period is 2 pi over B, which is 2. My phase shift, I don't have one. My midline is y equals 0. So my first X will start at 0. And I'm going to do 1/4 times my period, which is 2/4, which is 1/2. So I am adding 1/2 each time. So my second X value is 1/2. My third is 2/2, or you can reduce it. Then 3/2, and then 4/2. So I'm going to place my X values: 0, 1/2, 2/2, 3/2, 4/2. And 1/2 and negative 1/2. Okay, so my midline is at 0. And remember, for the cosecant curve, your first X is your asymptote. And then we would go up to 1/2, but since it's negative, we're going to go down. Your third one is an asymptote. And then you're going to go up to 1/2. And your last one is an asymptote. So remember, the sine graph, or the curve, would curve in this direction. But we want cosecant. So when A is negative, it's going to start off with the relative maximum and then your relative